Today, we're going to talk about, I think, largely the modified auction, which is probably 60 or 70% of the transactions that we do are kind of hybrid modified auctions, whereby there's no asking price on a business. The business is taken out to market, and there are clear process rules. In order to participate as a buyer, you need to understand where the finish line is. No one wants to negotiate. One of the most frustrating things on the planet is negotiating with somebody on the other side of the table who just never stops negotiating, right? Like, where is the finish line? How long are we going to continue to negotiate? Is the buyer always going to want more? Is the seller always going to want more? And we never really come to a conclusion. So setting process rules and showing the buyers the finish line and telling them specifically how they get to that finish line allows us to do a few things. First off, by laying out a defined process rules that are very clear, buyers aren't holding back. You can take a race, for example, right? Let's say that you've got a marathon. You watch the Boston Marathon. It's always in the last 5 or 10 minutes that all of the runners are now sprinting to the finish line. If you go to a race and there's no finish line and somebody shoots off the gun, you don't know at what point you need to start sprinting. You don't know who's going to win. Is it just the last guy standing? So I think it's very important to set clear process rules. And most of our clients, when they come into this whole process, don't really understand that a sell-side process is really one in which it's an auction process. Quite frankly, there's no other way to say it. There's no asking price on a business. Materials go out into the market and acquirers have to bid. And we use closed bid processes, so no buyer knows what another buyer is bidding. And the whole goal, at least at the very front end of the process, is not to find ourselves negotiating directly with any specific acquirer. You want to have, ideally, at minimum, 6 buyers in a process. I think when you start getting north of 12 to 15, it starts to get cumbersome. But if you can shoot for a high single-digit number of buyers in a process, you will likely get enough demand that will ultimately force up the price. And my job is multifaceted. My first job is to make sure that I conceal as much information as possible on my side of the table. So being on the sell side, what I try to focus on is not having sellers reveal too much information that might cause the buy side to get leverage. So for example, if you want to sell a business and you call up an acquirer, one-on-one between you, the seller, and me being the buyer, for example, it's pretty easy for me to understand, okay, this guy really has a high degree of desire to sell because he's calling me all the time, he's emailing me. I told him I'd take a look at some materials, maybe get back to him with an offer. I might be a little bit slow in getting back to him and he's calling looking for the offer. So, I can judge desire. Sellers often will talk about large, big ticket purchases that they're going to make. One of the reasons why I'm selling this business is I'm buying a ranch in Utah, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. We want to conceal as much of that information as we possibly can because we don't want the other side, we don't want the buyers to really understand level of desire or necessity. In addition to concealing information, one of the other things that is extremely important is trying to ferret out as much information as we possibly can to help us in negotiation. So, for example, when we meet with buyers in a process, we want them to do the extreme majority of the talking. And there's a lot of things that I think are counterintuitive where, when I sit down with acquisition meetings or just the conversations that I have with buyers all the time, I'm trying to understand what sort of quarter they're having, what sort of year they're having, what sort of strategic initiatives are going on behind the scenes, because there's multiple examples that I've talked about over the years on the Boardroom Buzz where we've sold businesses at prices that were substantially higher than what they should have otherwise garnered, because we knew a company was having a bad quarter and needed to cover up some organic growth issues. And so they were going to do a big acquisition. And when we understand the decision-making structure and the incentives of the people behind the scenes at the target, we can definitely use that to our favor. So we want to ferret out information, understand as much about the individuals who are doing the transactions, what their personal career aspirations are, how they get compensated. We want to understand those things. We want to understand if the M&A guy is actually getting paid to commit capital, right? If he's getting paid as a percentage of EBITDA or as a percentage of total committed capital, now I've got somebody on the other side of the table from me that has a very, very strong incentive to do a particular deal. So understanding the decision-making structure and ferreting out as much information as possible is extremely important in the early stages of the negotiation. And quite frankly, having my client say the least amount as possible. I mean, always be very kind, always be very courteous, but do far more listening than talking. The other aspect of an appropriate sell-side process is to have deadlines, right? When you think about union negotiations, 90% of progress is made within an hour prior to strike, where both sides have pretty adverse consequences. So we expect that in any sort of formal sell-side process, the majority of the concessions take place at the end. And it's not a union negotiation, right? There's no collective bargaining agreement. We don't have a strike deadline. We have to actually impose a deadline. So using deadlines allow us to corral buyers into making decisions simultaneously. Let's say that we started with 10 buyers, we did it round one. So what does that mean? That means round one bids are due at Thursday at 5 p.m. Okay. We receive our first offers. We've done ourselves a favor because we're getting all of our offers simultaneously. So we don't have a bird in the hand versus two in the bush. We're not doing things sequentially. We're doing everything in parallel. So now we have 5 offers on the table and we're able to look at them and compare them, right? And when you're looking at something side by side, it's very easy to compare and contrast. So now we've got these 5 bids. As we go into round 2, we're going to ask the acquirers to revise their bids forward. So we want more money from every one of them, and we're going to systematically eliminate them from process. But by imposing specific deadlines, we're requiring the other side to act in a formal process where the deadline doesn't impact us in any way, shape, or form. And the teeth behind that deadline is if you don't provide your bid by such and such a date, you're eliminated from process. So if they don't get it in, and quite frankly, in the deal world, things happen, right? There's investment committees, there's bosses that travel, there's folks that have to approve it. So it's not a hard and fast rule. It's not in by 5, you're completely out of the process. We definitely discipline repeat offenders in this matter. But either way, it puts us in the sell side in a position where we're not waiting a week or 2 weeks for an offer. Deadline's on a Wednesday, we get them on Wednesday, we might get them on Thursday, but we're not waiting a week or 2, and we're certainly not calling and tracking down the buyer looking for them. So that is using deadlines or using the concept of time to our advantage. Remember, a deadline that impacts the other side of the table that does not impact us helps us from a leverage perspective.